Next, I would like to invite onto the stage Daniel Zhu, who is Senior Legal Consultant at DLA Piper Middle East. And Daniel is going to discuss the design, build, finance, operate model and ask the question whether it's worth the risk. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm grateful to Construction Week for inviting me to deliver this presentation. The topic of my presentation is on a form of PPP model, something that has not been explored fully, but it's the DBFO model. Well, if it isn't daunting enough for me to follow a very knowledgeable panel before that, I've also just realized that I'm standing between everyone here and lunch that is on the way, so I will try to keep this as succinct as possible. Here's what I hope to achieve today, and that's a brief summary of what we hope to cover in this session. And I think I would like to just start by setting the scene and quickly revisit some of the general observations that we can make from a PPP project. Like I started off saying, PPP project is one of the, or rather, the DBFO model is one of the forms of PPP that's been employed here. So just a quick overview on the PPP model. Now, there are many applications, and here are the few examples that we can see. PPPs are collaborative organizational structures supported by public, the private, and sometimes even the non-profit partners. Now, PPP has been used by governments as collaborative models to attract mainly financing from the private sector, or even to bring in private sector expertise into projects that the government may or may not have that much experience on. So, what are the rationales that we can look at when we look at a PPP project? We start off with the public sector. And for the public sector, like I've covered earlier, it taps on the expertise of the private sector, the technology, the innovation. It raises quality and also helps in cost management. And of course, there is that cost efficiency that comes with a PPP project, generally because when you combine design, construction, and financing to a single point of contact, then the contractor or the project company now has an incentive to ensure that the project design takes into consideration the entire operational life cycle. So then that drives the efficiency that is often talked about in a PPP project. And of course, then for the public sector, there is also the element of risk sharing. I'll touch a little bit more on risk sharing, but on a large, complex project, such risk can then be moved onto the private sector. Now, what is in it for the private sector then? For the private sector, it definitely, one of the key advantages that come with PPP projects would be the increase in business opportunities for the private sector. The private sector now has access to deliver a full suite of services to the government that's traditionally sometimes outsourced or rather kept within the government structure. And of course, there would be additional income streams for a project company from the private sector. One of the few sources of income that we can look at would be the development fee when the project company liaises with the financiers, with the banks. And of course, for the private sector, the other advantage for them would be it moves from just a pure construct only to being able to introduce innovation and design into the project. Now, what is in it for then the members of the public? I think we must always bear in mind that one of the key objectives of a PPP project would be a delivery of service for the general public. That's not always the case, but that's usually the focus. So for the members of the public, when a deal is structured properly, then the delivery of services can then better meet the needs of the public, and public interest is generally enhanced through a delivery of service that's at a better value for money. Now we look at I've introduced briefly the PPP models, and what this diagram that we have now on the slide, I hope to show, would be a sliding scale of what is on the left, the most traditional form of procurement. So ownership vests in the government. And on the extreme right, we're looking at privatization of services. And you could see that under the name of DBFO, there are certain variants of that. What we're concerned with would be the third bullet point below, where it's a design, build, finance, and operate project, but ownership vests in the government. Now, on the DBFO model, one of the key, like I've said earlier, is that there is a general lack of ownership within the project company. So it doesn't mean that the private sector cannot own land or assets or facilities, but that's just not usually the norm. Now, what are the considerations one can think of when there is ownership that is transferred into the private sector? One of the examples would be where the facility or the asset is not dedicated just solely for the government's use. So then it makes sense for the ownership to rest in the private sector. And of course, the other consideration would be the usage of the government. So in a facility that's not purely used by the government, or where the government only anticipates a portion of that lifespan to be used by the government, then it makes sense for ownership to rest in the private sector. So another consideration why ownership can rest in the private sector would be where the private sector is best placed, or the owner, which is the private sector, is best placed to bring about enhancements and upgrades, in so doing future-proofing that facility. But more typically, DBFO structure that we're familiar with means that the government retains ownership of the land and therefore the facility that sits on it. This is most suitable for services which are critical and unique for the government. But the key then, and the key concern of most project companies coming in, the private sector, would be what sort of security it has. So it's then critical, like one of the questions raised earlier, that the public sector has to assure the private provider and its finances that their investment in the facility will be safeguarded even though they hold little or probably no title. So again, this ties in later on to a point that I'll cover, where political and legal environments are very important in laying this groundwork, so that there is that confidence that the public gives to the private sector. Now, what are the responsibilities then of the private sector? Quite naturally, DBFO, so design, the output specification should be set by the public sector. But as far as possible, this output specification should not be too prescriptive, or the design itself with too much interference. The key is to make sure that the facility delivers its value for money. So in general, the design should not be too prescriptive by the public sector. And built naturally, the construction process itself. Financing then can take a few forms. It can take the form of bank loans. It can take the form of bonds, equity, to finance the upfront costs of the construction itself. And then operation itself, it has, like I said, or rather on the slides, there are two forms of operations, the ancillary services and the core services. Ancillary services are usually facilities that are non-core functions, such as the cleaning, the maintenance, or the transport. Core services then would be examples like the supply of water, the desalination, or the provision of power. Now conceptually, in a DBFO project, the private sector does not have to undertake all operations related to delivering the public service. The key is the provision of services that is efficient and most competent at performing. So for example, in a school, a private sector can step in the provision of waste management, in the provision of security, and the public sector can then take over the core functions, which is the education services. So where outputs can be clearly defined and measurable, then there is greater room for the private sector to step in and own, or rather not own, but to greater room for the private sector to be involved in the process. I'll turn quickly now to the contractual characteristics of a DBFO project. I'll start from the top and I'll move clockwise down. So typical construction a typical characteristic of a DBFO contract, it's a long-term project. So it usually ranges from 15 to 30 years. So the mindset shift of the contractor here is critical. It's no longer just a construction project. The mindset now has to be taken is more of an industrialist. It's a 15 to 30 year commitment. And in terms of the contractual mechanism in the DBFO project, parties should be realistic to expect that there will be changes to services to be delivered over a lifespan of 15 to 30 years. So there must be a certain level of flexibility within the contract to allow for parties to adjust, to change, and to adapt to changes in demand of the services required. And on the next point, outcome and output specifications. This is the vital part in driving the innovation that is promised in a DBFO project or a PPP project. So it's expected to be able to generate management efficiencies, and it's important for the public to clearly define what needs to be achieved, but leaving room for the private sector to innovate. So the key here on output specifications, the key takeaway point is what needs to be achieved and not how it's supposed to be achieved. So that's a point that has to be considered when parties negotiate the outcome. And I'll cover payment mechanisms shortly, but on sharing of responsibilities, this is the point where most people are concerned about. My only input to this point must be that it's a partnership. Often people forget that it's a partnership. So risk must be balanced, and the temptation to load the risk on the private sector is there, but one must also consider which party is best able to bear the risk, because if the risk is loaded onto the private sector and it's not equipped to deal with such risk, the reaction would then be to price for such risk, and it would just drive the entire construction cost upwards. Now we look at the financial characteristics of a typical DBFO project. So the private sector would provide project finance, typically through equity or through debt finance, and the incorporation of a SPV is usually owned by one or more of those equity investors. The other shareholders within the SPV could include the contractors themselves or other financial investors. Equity providers in the SPV or in the project have vested interest in the project, and they only see returns after the project is completed and successfully operational. And for the debt providers, they are typically banks, so they hold the overall risk when the debt is not paid. So it's important in the initial stages that the banks do their due diligence to make sure that the project, as the panel has mentioned earlier, it's bankable, it's feasible. To manage risk, banks often have step-in rights to take over failing projects and bring in new contractors. Of course, this is subject to the approval of the government or the public sector. The second point of publicly funded is not accurately reflected, but what I was trying to explain is that at the end of the day, the funding of that project is recovered from the public. So members of the public often pay back for the project in terms of end-user charges, and in projects like power and water and utilities, then it's the public sector that purchases it in uptake agreements. So here's a general structure of how a DBFO model would look like. As promised, I'm going to go into payment mechanisms. So the key to remember is in a DBFO project, or for most PPP projects, there is no payment until its completion. But even after completion, that doesn't trigger payment. It has to be completion and successful operation. So if a project runs late, the risk of payment rests with the project company. And once, like I foreshadowed earlier, once the project is handed over or completed, it doesn't mean that payment automatically starts. Payment starts only when the services are available. So the government only pays when services are delivered, and once operational, recurring payments are varied, but often pegged to specified standards. So an overview of how it looks like when one is expecting to be paid under a DBFO model. During the design and construction phase, there's just no payment, and payment kicks in only after the operation phase. And the term I've used there is a unitary charge. So what's a guideline for a unitary charge? Typically, there is no payment, like I said, until service is available. It's only made to the extent that the service meets the availability and performance standards. What are the elements we can expect in a unitary charge? This is something that the panel has covered previously as well. There are a few elements that we can look at. One is the availability, the other is the performance, and the last, or the more common one, would be usage-based. And of course, most projects use a combination of two or more of the elements that I've described earlier. One point to note on usage-based, it goes back again on the risk, because the transfer of this responsibility on a usage-based unitary charge is that this particular transfer of responsibility is only appropriate where the provider can influence that use and demand, because that's the income stream that the provider is looking forward to. Now we look at some of the expectations parties can have when they go into a DBFO model and some of the risk one can expect. Now on risk allocations, where do this risk go? Typically, there are just 4 key sectors that risk can flow through: the public sector, the insurance, subcontractors where the project company or the contractor passes down that risk, or retained risk where the project company holds on to some of that risk that's been passed on in the process. Here's a general summary of a typical risk allocation. So again, like I've said, in a PPP project, such as a DBFO model, it's a partnership, so the balance of risk is key. There is always that temptation to pass all the risk onto the private sector. Again, the consideration must be that it must be a risk that the private sector is best positioned to cope. Because, like I said, if the private sector cannot cope with that risk, what it would do would be simply to price for that risk in a contract price. Then the value itself in the project is gone because the price has gone up. So what are typical risks that resides with the operator, the provider, the private sector? So of course you have the maintenance costs, you have unforeseen maintenance requirements, changes in demand, changes in the nature of demand, insurance cost increases, changes in the laws, and of course latent effects. The last point specifically in the context of toll roads, which is quite typically used for DBFO models. What are some of the risk factors that can be passed back or retained in the public sector? So where you have a breach of concession contract by the government, then that is a risk factor that can be retained in the public sector. Acts of other bodies. So again, back to the point where public sector support is critical, communication is critical. The failure to provide access or the impacts of work taken by public bodies that have affected the facility or the asset. There are some revenue-specific factors that we can look at, which would be, let's take again the context of a toll road, which is quite typical for a DBFO model. Then the changes in revenue-specific factors would include competing roads being opened up, or new access points, exit points that would basically affect the collection of tolls and directly impact the revenue stream of the project company. Now we look at how parties then should manage their expectations. It can be argued that the private sector financing under some models will result in higher financing costs, since borrowing rate of the private sector is generally higher than the public sector. This financing cost itself would be higher because lending to the private sector is inherently riskier than lending to a government body or a private sector, a public sector. So private financing, though, is an important element in a DBFO model, because and with that, it helps to instill better discipline in the use of capital. So there is an incentive then for parties to optimize the use of capital. And higher borrowing rates by the private sector can be mitigated by ensuring that the banks